Good evening. Voters are on track to do something in Washington state they have not done in 108 years, and it is not good news for President Trump. Survey USA asked 650 adults between Saturday and this past Tuesday, if the November election were today, who would you vote for? 57% said former Vice President Joe Biden. Just 31% said Trump. The chasm grows bigger if you remove the undecideds or a serious third-party challenger. The last Republican presidential candidate to receive less than 35% of the Washington state popular vote was William Howard Taft in 1912, who got 23% of the vote. Of note, 84% of those polled that claimed they were a Republican went towards Donald Trump, but Democrats and independents definitely in the Biden camp, with independents going Biden 54-21. Trump also had better numbers in the head-to-head matchup in Western Washington than Eastern. Let's move on. His approval rating, another story. Our poll shows Washingtonians disapprove of President Trump's job performance by a 61-33 margin. Governor Jay Inslee, almost the opposite. His approval rating growing during the pandemic, 61% of approve of the job he's doing, with 29% disapproving. So what does this mean in a potential November election for Inslee, who is seeking his third term? We told you yesterday his main Republican challengers are all polling in single digits, and we asked for opinions on head-to-head matchups. Inslee beats Tim Eyman almost 2-1. Lauren Culp and Joshua Freed had similar numbers. Phil Fortunato was slightly higher with 34% in a potential head-to-head matchup. What do the numbers mean for the Republican Party as a whole heading into the summer and fall? We asked our King 5 News political analyst, former Bush White House Press Secretary Scott McClellan, and Obama Deputy Director Ron Sims.
It means you start from a strong disadvantage because of the top of the ticket and because of the general sentiment of the public toward the Republican Party in the state of Washington at this time. Now, that is not to say it's that's the way it's going to be nationally. That's just the way it is in Washington state, a solid blue Democratic state. And yes, Donald Trump is currently about 15 points behind what level of support he achieved in 2016 in Washington state.
Well, if they have political consultants, they're going to tell them to distance themselves from the president, because those are awful numbers. But it also dries up people who would finance campaigns and make contributions, because they're going to look and say, to make an investment right now on a Republican candidate is a poor investment.
I spoke with State Republican Party Chair Caleb Heimlich this afternoon, who believes that Republicans can still make gains despite the president's approval rating. He told me, and I quote, "We can compete in Washington state even when the president is getting in the high 30s. We can still gain ground, I would argue, from where we're at today." That was his quote. He also told me he believes that Inslee at 50% in the polling amongst support of all candidates means he is still vulnerable in the fall. That's the story for now. I'm Chris Daniels, King 5 News.